Right, good evening everybody and welcome to ISSP's 7 to 8 talks. Thank you so much for being here. I wish this was in a lecture theatre at York University, it's where it should be, but thanks to the tech wizardry of basically Bootham School, we are aiming for live and YouTube, so thank you very much indeed. I'm so excited about tonight. We are welcoming Dr. Tom McLeish, who is a physicist, who, whether he describe himself as a theologian, I don't know, but I really think he is. He is a writer, he's a speaker, he's spoken all over the country, spoken on Radio 4, and he is looking at the amazing question of whether science has disproved God. And I just can't wait for tonight. So enjoy, write those questions down as the talk progresses, because for the last 15 minutes, it'll be questions which I just can't wait for Tom to answer. So we are really privileged tonight. Can't do a round of applause, but Tom, thank you so much for giving your time for York ISSP for doing this. And just thank you loads, and over to you.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. Oh, it's just lovely to be here. I'm really delighted. I realise I've got slightly the wrong title. I realise it's the Independent School Partnership, not just All Saints School, but there you are. You're specially billed. But I thought everyone would love to see a picture of York Minster against a picture of distant galaxies taken through the Hubble Space Telescope, because that basically sums up the talk. So now we can go on to questions. No, so that's what we've done. I've taken the title. Has science disproved God? I've no idea what that title means, but we'll try and work that out as we go along. I've got a sub. Professors like longer words and longer sentences, so I've invented another title: Is scientifically informed living compatible with belief in God? So if you like longer words and sentences, but it means the same thing. Let's go on. Well, I thought I'd better introduce myself just a wee bit, because I'm a strange academic, because I do different things. But I am a professor of soft matter and biological physics. I was that for years. So I do the physics of soft stuff, and that's literally what it is. It's jellies and polymers and plastics and now biological material. I'm fascinated by the way things flow. I've done a lot of work with industry on new materials, molecular materials. I'm now working with biologists. And as you'll see, my science work has always taken me across boundaries. I'm a big trespasser. I don't stay within one little science, within one little box. I love doing physics with chemical engineers and with scientists, with biologists and chemists. And right now, as you'll see, I'm doing also work in the humanities departments at York University, not just the theology you mentioned. I've also got a fascinating project, which I'll tell you all about perhaps another time. May just sneak into this next half hour on medieval science. So we'll see how we get on. I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about some work I'm doing right now, which is related, in fact, to work that one of my colleagues and I have done together the last few months on one of the COVID virus proteins. We've been, a lot of academics right around the world, whatever we're doing, we've asked ourselves over the last few months, is there anything I know how to do that might help one day with the virus? And I'm interested in the physics of how biological molecules move. Actually, this is not a virus protein; it's another protein attached to a piece of DNA. But I don't know if you can all. Can you see this protein, this computer model of a protein molecule wobbling about? It's supposed to be vibrating very rapidly. If you can't, never mind. But I'm fascinated by the way that that the beautiful order we see in nature arises from a molecular world of chaos and uncertainty and randomness. And it's fascinating to me how order and structure arises out of a sort of substrate or a scaffold, which is moving around absolutely randomly, and that's what we call heat. And I suppose all my research over the years has been, to some extent, how phenomena emerge from a molecular world that's all dancing around like that. So I want to kick off with a story, a bit of history, really. that I read in the books that I read when I was a teenager. It's a story I've heard so many times, and it's the story of scientific history. And it go something like this: that science got going and flourished in the ancient Greek, particularly Greek and Rome, Greek world, Heraclitus, Thales, Aristotle, all that stuff, and was laid down. And then unfortunately, came Christianity. And with Christianity comes the Dark Ages, 1,000 years of Dark Ages, because all you get is dogma and faith rather than science. They told me, and the books say, that new thinking was systematically repressed because you've got to believe what the church believes in. And the church even taught in the Middle Ages that the earth was flat, and that was quite wrong. But Galileo said it was round, and he was tortured and imprisoned because of that. And Copernicus said that the Earth went around the sun and not the other way around, and that the Earth was round. But from the Renaissance, this 14th, 15th century, thankfully, a new secular approach to learning created a new birth. That's what Renaissance means, of the ancient Greek learning, which once more triumphed over the blind dogmatism of faith, and we can get on with being scientific. And that's why most scientists don't believe in God or anything like that. That sort of nonsense. So this is the story. Actually, as stories go, it's got the right ingredients. It's quite romantic. It's the story of darkness and light. It's the story of the triumph of truth over falsehood and the underdog over power structures. It's it's got all the right ingredients. The only slightly dubious aspect of it is that not a single part of this story, apart from the first bullet point, science did get going in the ancient world. Apart from that, not a single thing I've told you in the last 4 minutes is true. It's all wrong. Every single thing there is wrong. Historically wrong, evidently wrong. And yet it's the story that many believe is true. There are even science series on television, American television, US television, that tell this story. And there are even BBC education websites that tell this story, I'm afraid to say, and it's all nonsense. So we've got to unpick why it is we even think this is a question. Incidentally, this flat earth thing really, really gets me. Some of my work with the medieval thinkers has astonished me with the subtlety that with which they knew and taught in all their schools that the earth was a sphere, and how everybody in the year, say 1215, the year of the signing of the Magna Carta, everybody that went to school knew not just the earth was round, it knew how large the sphere was, and they knew why it is that we know that the earth was round. And that was back 800 years ago. It turns out that the first age in our entire, certainly European civilization, that has ever had anyone think the earth was flat is now. So that tells us something about how we should not look down on the learning of our ancients. Anyway, so let's try and get on with our question. So what does the question mean? Given that story isn't right, and the short version of the story is that actually the Christian church and Christian civilization has been the birthplace and the nursery of science in very important ways. So actually quite the opposite is historically evidentially true. Let's just explain why this conflict might have come from. Might science disprove God because it changes the way we explain things? Is it true that once upon a time people explained the natural world because God did things, and now we explain through science? We'll look at that. Maybe it's this history. Maybe once upon a time people believed in God, and now we believe in science, and so we just have to get with the beat, get with the time. Perhaps that's what's going on. Maybe it's something more subtle. Maybe what people mean by science telling God belief to move over is something to do with the appropriate source of mystery. We all need a bit of mystery in our lives. We all need a little bit of wonder and awe, and maybe once upon a time that came from religious belief and practice, and now it can come from science. After all, look at that beautiful picture of galaxies through the Hubble Space Telescope, and Einstein rings of distant galaxies focused into bands by dark matter. And what's not to get mysterious about that? Or meditative? Or maybe it just stops us thinking freshly. Maybe religious dogma sort of squeezes the mind like a cake mold or a jelly mold into a particular shape, and it prevents the sort of imaginative, creative thinking that science needs in the future? Well, there are many other ways of asking this question. I've thought of just 4 to see whether we can attack those in the time available to us. So let's tackle the first one. What about the way we explain things? Now, I think this is sort of put into words by one of the sort of atheist scientists of our time. He's retired now. Peter Atkins wrote a lot of books about physical chemistry. He says this sort of stuff: science and religion can't be reconciled. Religion has failed. Its failure should stand exposed. And science, with its currently successful pursuit of universal competence, should be acknowledged king. Now, this is overstating science. This is an articulation of what we call scientism, that science is the universal competence. Note that word universal. Atkins would say there isn't a problem in the world that can't be solved with science. If you think about it for a moment, that can't be quite true. We don't need to go anywhere near theology or religion to realize that that's not quite true. And of course, we've seen this over the last year. Following the science has been the political trope. But has politics always followed the science? Well, no, it hasn't. You have to bring other ways of thinking. Economic, political ways of thinking are also there, and they can't be reduced to the scientific. So this can't be true. Perhaps we better ask someone else. So let's ask, the guy who was voted Human of the Year, Person of the Century, rather, the 20th century, Albert Einstein. It's nice to know that a leading scientist was Person of the century. But he said this about religion and science. He says religion without science is blind, true, but science without religion is lame. Always wanted to know what he meant by that. Now, he wasn't an Orthodox believer, Jewish background. He wasn't a practicing Jew, but he clearly had a much more subtle approach to this question. He also said something about the universe as a whole, giving us a clue as to whatever might be behind the universe. The most incomprehensible thing Einstein said about the universe is that it is comprehensible. And why, indeed, might he not have said that? These extraordinary structures that have evolved in outer space, all the way down to the length scales of DNA in our cells. It is quite extraordinary, not only that this structure is there in the universe, but that the minds that evolved on those savannas in Africa to hunt, prey, and survive, namely, I'm talking about human beings, that those same minds can understand those distant galaxies, those tiny atoms, can, in some sense, comprehend the universe. This is quite wonderful. He also said other things. I mean, he said, so he says that in the face of the universe, we must feel humble. Einstein will also say, I don't want to just argue from authority here, but I do still want to point out that someone of the brain power as Einstein was saying that, no, this issue of the God question is much more subtle than anything that is remotely science versus God. Okay. Let me turn to someone else. Joseph Taylor, Professor Taylor, won a Nobel Prize in physics, as did Albert Einstein, but rather later in the 1990s. He worked, in fact, he discovered the first known binary pulsar. Now, those of you who've been following the work on gravitational waves of the last few years will know that the gravitational waves we've detected have come from black holes, 2 black holes circulating each other, crashing into each other. Objects that aren't quite heavy enough to be black holes will be the dense cores of dead stars orbiting around each other. But Joe Taylor, who's obviously an absolutely leading astronomer, said this. He said, a scientific discovery is also a religious discovery. There's no conflict between science and religion. Our knowledge of God is made larger with every discovery we make about the world. I'd love to know what he meant by that. So he's saying that scientific discoveries increase our knowledge not only of the world, but of God. He was both an astronomer and a committed Christian. Well, let's go back. What about the second question then? I mean, so obviously the end of the first idea of science replacing God as an explanation doesn't seem to be in accord with the way scientists themselves think about science. But what about history? So remember the part of that whole story that I read in the books when I was at school was that the early science, the scientific revolution, late Renaissance science, 17th century, the foundation of the Royal Society, of which I'm lucky enough to be a fellow now. And this is Robert Boyle, who's one of my great great heroes. I was so lucky to give a lecture in his name last month. I was asked to give the National Boyle Lecture. Robert Boyle, one of the founders of the Royal Society. Boyle's Law. Some of you, I expect, have learned about Boyle's Law. That's the one that says that the pressure of a gas in a gas is inversely proportional to its volume. There's this beautiful mathematical law that tells you how hard you have to push on your bicycle pump to squeeze the air into your tire, basically. And Boyle, one of the great early scientists who you might expect, if that story were true, to be part of this secular overthrow of a sort of medieval church-ruled world, said this: God is the author of the universe and the free establisher of the laws of motion. And that lecture series, which he began in 1690, and I gave the one in 2021 just last month, was established by Robert Boyle under the subject of science and religion, because he saw that the day would come when people would get confused about how they related to each other. Well, what about so much Boyle? Boyle, you might tell me, was also around. What about Newton? Let's go to Newton. He was the big brains of the 17th century, wasn't he? Well, let's see what Newton says about the Bible. I have a fundamental belief in the Bible. It's the word of God, says Newton, written by those who are inspired. I study the Bible daily. It turns out Isaac Newton wrote more theology than he did science, and he was a real serious New Testament theologian. He knew about the texts, and he did a lot of very careful work on textual comparison and translation to make sure that he had the best New Testament text from the original Greek he could. So Newton did a lot more than Newton's 3 laws. Well, what about the Great Revolution? The Great Revolution is this overthrow, wasn't it? People used to think the Earth was in the middle of the solar system, Ptolemy and Aristotle and all those ancient people, and it was Nicholas Copernicus who overthrew that and put the sun in the middle of the solar system and said that everything would be simpler if we thought of ourselves as whirling around the sun. What does he say about God? Perhaps he says this is overthrowing of God. No, he says this: to know the mighty works of God, to comprehend his wisdom and majesty and power, to appreciate in degree the wonderful workings of his laws, surely all this must be a pleasing and acceptable mode of worship to the Most High, to whom ignorance cannot be more grateful than knowledge. So, like John Taylor, Professor Taylor, Joseph Taylor, in our own age, actually Copernicus goes even further. Perhaps he talks of the science itself as a sort of worship. Perhaps, I'm sure when you are, perhaps those of you who are doing school courses in chemistry, perhaps, or physics, when you're doing those experiments on the lab, perhaps worshipping is maybe not the word that jumps immediately to your mind when you're trying to get the right measurements down in the notebook and prevent the acids from spilling on the bench. However, that's what Copernicus thought. Actually, incidentally, what the chemist Michael Faraday thought in the 19th century of Faraday's law, and for that very purpose, this is extraordinary. Yes, Faraday thought that Sunday was a great day to do science experiments because they were a sort of worship. We're finding some of the great scientists telling a very different story here. My favorite early modern astronomer, I have to say, is Kepler. I think Galileo is rather overrated. Actually, I'm going to get brickbats for saying that, but I would vote Kepler as the number one. He was just extraordinary. Working out the orbit of Mars was an ellipse. Galileo was about a century out of date, actually, in his astronomy. Kepler was right up to date, and took the best observations going by this wonderful Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe, to whose observatory I went a couple of years ago out in the Baltic. And he says this about his work, laying down the observations that gave Newton the information he needed to work out his theory of gravity. Those laws are within the grasp of the human mind. God wanted us to recognize them by creating us after his own image so that we could share in his own thoughts. And if piety allows us to say so, our understanding is, in this respect, of the same kind as the divine, at least as far as we are able to grasp something of it in our mortal life. Now, it may take you a little moment to grasp what Kepler's saying there, but like Copernicus, Kepler's even taking this further and relating the science he does to the theology he knows, And you may know there's an important strand within Christian theology, Judeo-Christian theology, that talks of human beings being made, in the Latin goes in imago Dei, in the image of God. And Kepler is working out what that means. And if it means that we are in some sense an image, then God's thoughts, we won't be the same as God, but we will be like a small projected image of God. So if God can see and understand the workings of the world, then we can do that in image, you see. Now, I know that my host tonight, her subject is actually English literature. Now, many of you out there with us here tonight are probably English and literature is more your subject than science. So perhaps I can suggest that if you like and intrigued by what Kepler says here, you might want to read Samuel Taylor Coleridge in his Biographica Literaria, where he says very much the same thing. He says that the human I, that the creativity in the great I am is reflected in the image of the lesser I ams that are human beings. And he would say his poetry was a sort of creation as science is. I'll come back and talk happily about science and poetry for an hour with you another time. We need to press on. So where does this conflict story come from? It's obviously not true. In fact, the reverse is true. Well, I'll tell you where it comes from. We know exactly where it comes from. It's one of the early conspiracy theories. And it's got a nasty story behind it. It's a nasty story because it's the church warring against itself. These two American gentlemen, Andrew White and John William Draper, wrote two best-selling books towards the end of the last century with titles all about conflict between religion and science, or the church and science. And these were by no means atheists. They were actually Protestants. And what they were trying to do is to argue that Catholicism, the Roman Catholic Church, is a bad idea because it has a bad history with science. And of course, science, late 1900s, the great up-and-coming new movement, they were warned that this would backfire, as indeed it did. And backfired in a terrible way because, of course, to write these books that purported to show that the history of science showed that the church and theology and religion and science had been always at warfare with each other, when they came across the truth that the evidence doesn't line up with their prejudice, of course, so they had to invent the story that I began this evening with. They invented this issue of the church teaching that the earth was flat. It's a lie. They invented the way we interpret the Galileo affair, as being a story about a warfare between religion and science, when it was actually the clash of massive egos before anything else. It also comes from their stories. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, what about surely the Bible says that the earth was made in 6 days, and that conflicts with science. Well, we can talk about this in question time if you like. I've done a bit of work on biblical creation stories. The Bible has at least 25 different creation stories. The first 2 chapters of Genesis have 2 in completely different language and setting to start with. And it isn't until the 20th century you get books like The Genesis Flood in 1961, Whitcomb and Morris, that purport to read Genesis as scientific, or Genesis 1, not Genesis 2, Genesis 1, as fact, that you start to get this set up. And there's a very sorry tale about how that came out of Seventh-day Adventism and of a pushback against extreme right-wing eugenics and evolutionism. But it's a 20th century social story, this invented conflict of fact. I'll say no more about that at the moment. We can go on later on. So Draper says, he invents this story and says the history of science is a narrative of 2 contending powers, expansive force of the human intellect on one side, and the compression arising from traditionary faith and human interests on the other. But he had to invent everything to say that. Let me give you one example. So one of the eras that Draper and White have it in for, and people like Carl Sagan and other historians, the other popular science populists of our time, are very guilty about in this regard. They call the Middle Ages the Dark Ages The only thing dark about them is their willful ignorance about them, as far as I'm concerned. Now, I know this is independent schools in York, so I've not bothered to translate the Latin there. I'm sure you must be halfway through that paragraph yourselves by now. So I'll explain what it is you're reading here. This is an extraordinary thinker in the early 13th century called Robert Grosseteste. He is the subject of that project I told you about. I've been working on now for 12 years with medieval scholars and scientists together. This extraordinary, who became Bishop of Lincoln in 1235. So there he is in an illuminated character A in a beautiful 13th century manuscript wearing his bishop's mitre. But before that, he was the tutor. He was the science teacher, the natural philosophy teacher to the early Franciscan students in Oxford. And he taught them astronomy, taught them mathematics, taught them geometry. And he wrote books about colour and light, about sound and the propagation of sound as a wave through the air. He did very basic early, so I call proto-experiments. He seems to have done that with light and water and sound. And here's an extraordinary paragraph where he's doing some very imaginative thinking work around the physical origin of the universe. So this is an example where medieval Christian thinking is actually, rather than squashing his mind, it's actually helping his mind expand. Let me explain. Aristotle, the ancient thinker that these medievals were taking on board, had a theory about the cosmos. And Aristotle's theory of the cosmos was that it was always been here. It never had a beginning. In fact, it couldn't have had a beginning because anything that starts has to have a cause that starts it. And if it's the universe, there can't be anything else to start it. So that was Aristotle's argument in a nutshell. But Grosseteste says, there is an alternative. Suppose God, which is who is outside the universe, can cause it. In fact, the Bible suggests the world was begun. But Grosseteste in 1235 doesn't say, and Genesis chapter 1 tells us the science of how the universe began. No, he knows we have to work out the science. There are clues there about the creation of light, and he's fascinated by how light and material work together. So he supposes that the beginning of the universe is a point of light, which then expands in a giant sphere. That second sentence there, lux enim per se in omnem partem se ipsem diffundit. Light itself expands in all directions. Ita ut a puncto lucisfera, from a small part of light into a sphere, however large. Yeah? You're getting it. I'm with Latin, I'm like Winnie the Pooh in English. You remember what Pooh says when Christopher Robin says, "Can you read, Pooh?" And Pooh says, "Yes, Christopher Robin, I can read. When people tell me what the words say, I can read them." I'm a bit like that with Latin. But you see, this is extraordinary to a 21st century physicist looking back at 13th century science. This is extraordinary because they're getting their minds around Aristotle, but they're not just staying with Aristotle, with the ancient. They're writing annotations on Aristotle. By the way, they're able to do this because Islamic science, through the Islamic Arab civilizations of the early Middle Ages in Baghdad and Cordoba, had got people like Averroes, had made so many strides before them. Much of Aristotle's work were translated into Latin in Europe from the Arabic, not from the Greek. They were inventing scientific method. They were doing this within a mental mindset of God's creation, which was feeding them new ideas. And some of those ideas were about reason and rationality. And it went like this. If there's reason and rationality in a mind that made the world, then it doesn't become irrational to suppose, which it otherwise would be, that we could understand it with our small minds, that the universe might be an ordered place, and that we might be able to learn about it through observation. So now I've got, English translation, light at the beginning of time, drawing it out with itself into mass the size of the world machine. We call this the medieval Big Bang. It's very similar in spirit to the 20th century Big Bang theory of the universe. And I'll just tell you a little bit of the sort of fun we have when scientists and medieval scholars get together and all read these texts with this interdisciplinary focus, with all the tools we each bring to bear. We scientists can sometimes see mathematical structures in the text that the humanities trained scholars who can see many other things that we can't, they are less attuned to the mathematics. So we've been able to build mathematical models of Grosseteste's expanding universe. We've been able to enjoy how this 800 years ago, people like Grosseteste think about what the scientific imagination is like. He has a word for it, solertia. And let me read you this beautiful paragraph. He's reflecting on thinking scientifically about the world. The mind, the scientific imagination, we call it, the penetrating power in which the mind's eye doesn't rest on the outer surface of an object, but penetrates to something below the visual image. For instance, when the mind's eye falls on a colored surface, it doesn't rest there, but descends to the physical structure of which the color is an effect. It then penetrates this structure until it detects the elemental qualities of which the structure is itself an effect. So he's diving in into the structure of nature. I don't know a better description in words of what science is. It's a very imaginative activity. So let me sum up this history thing. One of my great friends and colleagues, Peter Harrison, is a great professor of science and history of science religions now in Australia. He was in Oxford before, wrote a book called The Fall of Man and Foundations of Science. Those who have magnified, says Professor Harrison, more recent controversies about relations of science and religion and have projected them back into historical time simply perpetuate a historical myth. The myth of a perennial conflict between science and religion is one to which no historian of science, whether they are a confessional believer or not, would subscribe. So I hope that's just tidied up the history question. We had a third question, didn't we? Source of mystery. Well, let's just see whether those of all considerations, to the former, the foundation, to the latter, the crown of the edifice of every generalized worldview. Very interesting idea that Max Planck has about he's got that bit of Grosseteste as a starting with an idea of God that then frees you in some way to do science in fresh ways. Another great pioneer of quantum physics. By the way, if you're, I don't know why this is true, but if you want to be a pioneer in quantum physics, it really helped to be called Max in the 1920s. No idea why that is. Someone will do a PhD on that one day. But Max Born. Those who say that the study of science makes a man an atheist must be rather silly. I don't think that's quite as profound as Max Planck, but we get the message. Well, what about, I know, who should we talk to next? What about Heisenberg? Heisenberg, uncertainty principle. The great mathematical creator of quantum mechanics. What does Werner Heisenberg say about science and faith in God? The first gulp, he says, from the glass of natural sciences will turn you into an atheist. Perhaps he's got it. But at the bottom of the glass, God is waiting for you. Actually, it's much better in German. It goes something like, in Glasfinsternis, Gott wartet für euch. Which I rather like. Oh well, so we've drawn a blank, unfortunately, with quantum mechanics. In fact, it doesn't. This mystery, though it is a mystery, doesn't detract from the contemplative mystery, as the great mystics would have it, of God. It only adds. It only adds. Here's a lovely quotation, and it's right up to date. It's a good week to do this. John Polkinghorne, who I knew when I was a university student. Lovely guy. He died last week, so it's nice to be able to quote from John. Professor of theoretical physics. He did particle physics for many decades, and then when he was in his 50s, he decided he wanted to be a priest and a theologian. So he completely retrained and became Dean of Trinity Hall, Cambridge College in Cambridge, and he wrote loads of interesting books on this very subject. I won't read all of this. Let's just jump to the end. I believe that it is indeed the mind of the world's creator that is perceived in this way. That's when we do science. Science is possible because the universe is a divine creation. And this is from someone who has known a whole career in science, and really a whole career. He died when he was 90. Lovely man in theology and Christian pastorship. Okay, what about this fresh thinking thing? Well, let me just go back to one of my great heroines of the early modern period, the 17th century. This is Margaret Cavendish. Now, I should know about Margaret Cavendish. She wrote actually some wonderful poems. She wrote over 50 poems about atoms in about 1650. She also wrote one of the first ever science fiction books. It was not a great science fiction book, but it's a wonderful read, called The Blazing World, and there it is. It's about a whole new world that you can get to through the North Pole. Near the North Pole, it's up in the sky. Those of you who've seen his Dark Materials might begin to wonder where Philip Pullman got his idea from. But the reason that Margaret Cavendish wrote this book in the 17th century is because this is the century in which experimental science got going. That was the thing that got the Royal Society founded. Experimental science, experimental method. But the reason I've got Margaret Cavendish here is because she is one of the great minds that most clearly said why it is a surprise that experimental method works. Hey, that's what we're told. Of course, science is experiments. That's what we do. You have theories, you have predictions, you check the experiments, you do the experiments, you check the data. That's how you do science, obviously. But wait, it's obvious to us now, but it's not then. And the reason it was never obvious you should do experiments until about the 17th century was because you think about what the universe is like. I showed you my chaotic wobbling molecule. The universe out there, it's mixed, it's multi-component, it's huge. There's trillions of stuff out there. They're all connected, and they're behaving in a very mixed way, and a complicated way. And you're suggesting that I put 2 ingredients in a test tube, cut off from everything else, and that this ridiculously simple and artificial thing will teach me something about the rich and complex and interconnected world out there? Nah. It's not obvious, is it, that you learn much by doing experiments? And Cavendish wrote this book to say that the reason that Francis Bacon and Robert Boyle and others who were the Christian founders of the Royal Society were able to argue that experiments might just work is a piece of theological imagination. And that's why Peter Harrison, the Oxford and Australian professor of history, wrote his book about the fall and the foundations of modern science. Now, that's a whole lecture in itself, but it goes something like this, that part of the condition in which we put ourselves when we run away from God and hurt ourselves and hurt other people, one of the things we hurt is our relationship with nature, with the world. And we get more ignorant and more fearful of it. And therefore, because God wants to restore and heal all of us and all our relationships, one of the relationships God wants to heal is that relationship with the world. And that is why science is a gift. And that's why it's possible for us to get there step by step by making experiments. I've hugely oversimplified that argument, but it illustrates, I think, clearer than anything else, that a confessional theological belief over the centuries, far from being a compressive negation of mind and imagination, has fed imagination in just the way required to get science going. So, the actual question is a completely different one. The real question, the exciting question, and not just for science, but for art, for music, for politics, for sport, whatever you do, is not, can we reconcile sport with religion? Or can we reconcile music with religion? I mean, that's as ridiculous as can we reconcile science with religion? Now you'll see why it is. It's people who've thought through the question of, okay, what does this gift of painting, art, dance, sport, or jazz, what does it mean within a worshipping life, within a God-obedient life, within within, say, a Christian calling, a vocation. And here are just a few books, one of them is by me, I admit, of people who try to think this through. Nick Waterstorff in terms of art, Jeremy Begbie, a wonderful book on what music means as a gift of God, not just for singing in church, but a whole gift of music, and Tim Keller about work in general. So actually, maybe this is what we should have been talking about. Just to illustrate how this is working, I want to say something about some projects I've been involved with, like a sort of experiment the last few years. This is a project that started in Durham. Now it's between Durham and York, and we've very fortunately had some funding from an organisation called Templeton Fund to help churches engage with science. And all I'm going to say is, if the conflict thing had been true, you would have thought, would you not, that it would be an uphill struggle to get churches engaged with science projects. It's been a dream, from small little church projects who are taking their vicar to the lab, to Ely Cathedral that turned the entire cathedral into a dinosaur museum. It's just been natural. And I wonder why that is. So I just want to finish by taking us back to another poem. Not really had a poem that's found in the Bible. It's my, second favorite, it doesn't matter. One of my very favorite Bible passages. It's a poem where God answers a suffering person called Job, who has questions about why he is suffering unrighteously. But it's one of the most beautiful, if not the most beautiful, poems in the ancient world, originally written in Hebrew. And every stanza of the poem is a question about nature, the springs of the deep, the way to the abode of light, where the ice is formed, the laws of the heavens, why the Pleiades stars are clustered together. And in that book, there is a beautiful other hymn called the Hymn to Wisdom. And if you remember Grosseteste's vision of science, where the human eye dives in its imagination down into the world, this says the same thing. And this ancient text, hundreds of years BC, has, and it chooses the miner. It tells a little metaphorical story about the miner, the silver mine. Can you see? There's a mine for silver, and where the miner does what he or she does under the ground. The miners dangle and sway, and they can see that last sentence. They see the earth. Its rocks are the source of lapis. It's flecked with gold. The earth changed by fire. And the reason this text is talking about miners, by the way, at Durham, I worked at Durham for 10 years, and Easington Colliery Parish Church has this in the stained glass window, this poem. It's called the Miners' Poem, or the Miners' Hymn, Miners' Prayer. And every school child in junior schools in Easington knows this prayer, because it's the place in the Bible where miners are taught of as very special people. And they are special people, but they're also special people because they have eyes that see nature from underneath. And as the text goes on, even the king of wild beasts, not even the hawk, can see nature as the miners do. But there is someone else who looks on nature like this, and that's God. So right at the highest poetry of the Old Testament is a set of poems that is about the way that we look into nature in its detailed, structured, measured way, like God, in obedience to God. In other words, it's a foundational text within biblical theology and the Bible story that lays a foundation for science to happen. It also tells us how to expect our relationships with nature to go. Over the last year, we've seen so many different stories whirling around the coronavirus, haven't we? When we have a vaccine, someone said it's unmitigated evil. We brought it on ourselves. All these stories. And actually, I've been involved in a project with the churches. Churches have been really important at pointing people to the science about the vaccine, because it's the natural thing to do. And I've just got these very pagan sort of narratives on the front. This philosopher on the right, the philosopher Jean-Pierre Dupuy, says comes up again and again in the way we interact with nature. I'm going to go on through here and just finish. So let's just conclude. The vast majority of great scientists, I'm certainly not one of those, but I'm a scientist, do not agree that science and God disagree in any sense. I've got to the end and was able to show you, I hope, that actually the roots of science are very old. Actually, part of this healing with nature story of the Bible, it's actually very positive what the Bible has to say about how we engage with nature, and that science is therefore not in conflict, it's at the heart of the Christian worldview. But that removing this false opposition of science and faith that we're doing this evening is a really important public work, whether you are a Christian or a Buddhist or a person of faith or Jew or not. Actually getting rid of this nonsense, which is nonsense, you can see it's nonsense, whoever you are, is important because it's part of this story that circulates around an unhealthy public narratives for science. We've learned just how important it is to have a supportive, receptive, critical engagement with science over this last year. Few books there, but at this point I'm going to finish, and thank you so much for listening to all that. And I'm really looking forward to some questions, perhaps, as we go on. Thank you very much.
Okay, folks, start putting some questions in the chat. If you can do that as quickly as possible, because we've not got much time for questions. I've got loads, but I'd far rather they came from you. So if we can start getting questions into the chat. I'm going to ask one while we're waiting for the first questions to come into the chat, which is, we've had a very, very odd year with the coronavirus. Do you think that has actually made the idea of faith and science merge more because we're finding out more about faith and we're having to have faith in science in a way that actually directly affects all our lives? So do you think it actually brings us closer?
Yes, well, I said right at the end there.
Sorry, Tom, Right, we've got some brilliant questions in the chat, and we just need Dr. McLeish to come back. Really hoping that Tom comes back very, very quickly, because I certainly can't answer any of the questions that are coming up in the chat. So it's giving us a lovely time to just get the last questions through, and I really don't want him to freeze now. Yes, that's a brilliant question, Annie. That is an absolutely brilliant question. Which creation story is the most different one from the one we all know? I read Tom's book, and I just thought the one was in Genesis, and I realized if you read Ecclesiastes and Genesis and the second chapter of Genesis and Proverbs, there's all sorts of creation stories in the Bible, which was absolutely amazing. So if we can just wait, I'm really, please don't go away for a moment. Our wonderful technician is trying to get us back together, but some of the questions we've got, and I really want, Karen, I really want your question to be answered. Where do you see faith and science going in the future is a brilliant question. Ewart, I love that as an image. Could the universe be like a light turning on as the universe expands outward and the light can be turned off? That's absolutely brilliant. That is a fabulous question. So please, Tom, come back, because it would just be so good if we could get these questions up and running. And I'm sure Luke, who is our marvelous technician, is doing all he can to sort that out. So I'd be really grateful if you held on, if we tried to get Tom back, and I will try. Oh, this looks promising. Yay, sir, you're back.
Sorry about that.
We're going to totally ignore my questions because The ones from the young people are so much better. So could the universe be like a lamp turning on as the universe expands outwards and the light can be turned off in a long time, such as the death of the universe? So could you see it in that sort of imagery? We've had light at the beginning. Could light turn us off?
Well, actually, that was this man Robert Grosseteste's idea.
Wow, well done, Hewitt.
Actually, that when God said, "Let there be light," that was a light turning on the beginning, and the light expands outward. That was precisely Hewitt. That was precisely his idea in this beautiful text called "On Light" from about the year 1225. So it's involved. It's on the net, it's on the web in English translation. If you want to look up Robert Grosseteste De Luce on light, you will find a translation on the internet and be able to read this, which is exactly your idea. Of course, if you turn the light on, you then might get a collapse. What we've actually discovered since then, of course, we aren't still in 1234. We discovered that there seems to be another force expanding the universe beyond light, because the expansion is getting faster and faster. We can look, as it were, back in time when we look at things a long way away, because light takes a while to get to us. And so there's a thing called dark energy, which you may have heard of, that looks as if it is self pushing the universe apart, but no one knows what it is. And it's one of the great puzzles for science right now.
Wow. Sorry, we've got so many questions and I really want to pick out some brilliant ones. Just little questions like from Karen Evans, where do you see faith and science going in the future? That's one heck of a question.
Great. I can see it coming up on the screen. That's fantastic, Karen. Well, I know where I'd love to see it going in the future and where I am seeing it beginning now. So I would like, because I think they have been historically cousins and siblings really, and can in the future. I'd like to see all ordination colleges or seminaries, places where pastors and priests are trained, having science courses and theology science courses. And believe it or not, that is actually happening. We have a program we're funding from this project in York called Science for Seminaries, and we have 9 theological schools that have applied for grants that we can give them to do this. So things are really happening. We have conferences for bishops, actually bishops and equivalent high leadership in churches, where we get them to meet young scientists in labs. And again, this thing happens. So everyone's slightly wary of everyone else to start with, but within 15, 20 minutes, everyone's chatting away and doing experiments together. It happens over and over. So so in the future, I can see them feeding off each other. I can see the faith communities helping us in our country to promote science, but promote it critically, to make sure that science doesn't come a completely dominated, sort of out of control force and just does everything because it has to, but encourages people to understand science in congregations in the same way. I mean, I love classical music. I play it in a very amateurish sort of way. I love jazz music too. I could never be a professional, but I can enjoy it critically. That's what I think churches can help everyone do with science. So there are a few ways in which I can see it going. Thank you.
I think I'm just going to have to pick 3 more, and I want to pick loads more. In the Bible, really good question. Which creation story is the most different one? You said and I read your book, you said there's lots of creation stories in the Bible. Which ones are different to the one we all know?
Oh, well, they're all different. They're all different. The Psalms and the prophets are full of them. They're very short. So there's a simple little one. So it's in Psalm 33 is one example. Psalm 104 is another. It's often there. It's just in 3 verses. It says this: the Lord created the heavens and the earth, the heavens above, the foundations of the earth, and he separated the waters from the dry land. That's it. And you get that little, like a postage stamp creation story. Over again, Genesis chapter 1 is a development of that. Genesis 2 is different because it starts all over again. This is in the beginning, and it takes the human beings from the dust of the earth. My favorite one is Proverbs chapter 8. Go and read Proverbs chapter 8, where creation is so there's someone helping God, and she's a little girl called Sophie. Well, she's wisdom. She's wisdom personified as a little girl, delighting. And she's like a sandpit. She's throwing up little waterfalls and castles and things. Many others, but they just give you some idea of the variety of creation stories there are in the Bible. John's Gospel, the great Christmas reading, is another one. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. Nothing was created that was not created by the Word. That's a creation story. So some of them quite small.
I think I can only go for one more, and they're all on the trail, so we can look at it later on. But there's this lovely one. 3 or 4 people have asked it in different ways. Without science, where do you think we would be now? And do you think religion would be the unquestionable truth still?
No, well, I don't. You see, religion never was an unquestionable truth. People question theology all throughout the whole story of theology is fascinating. It's all about questioning. Really, people always ask questions. I don't know where it would be without science, because science or the imagination behind science has always been with us. We might have a sort of alchemy, I don't know, but it would still be based on science, but we might know it in a different way. It's a wonderful question, but I don't know really the answer.
And I said that was the last one, and I just sort of can't.
I was brief though. I was brief.
You were brief there. That's my excuse, and I'm sticking to it. If God exists, did he create science for us as humans to discover and find out more about our universe, or has science as a concept always existed? Just, wow. If God exists, did he create science for us to discover? What a question.
So I think that science, the ability to do science, has always been part of human beings made by God in God's image. I think that's what science is. I think science is looking on the world with the same sort of love and understanding in image as God, the world's creator, does. And I think that in the same way that we are an image of God, we therefore create. If God creates the world, we create an image of the world. And I don't know a better way of explaining what science is than creating an image of the world in our minds that reflects what the atoms and galaxies and DNA and the squirrels are doing out there in the actual world. So I think both of the things you said, Naaman, are true, that it's always that God did create science for us, but right at the beginning. So it's always been there with us, and is very much part of us. I think that's a lovely message to finish with, because what I want to say is that in the same way that God has gifted human beings with song and story and art and creativity all around, it's what makes us human and special and gives life a meaning and a community meaning. Science is part of those things, and science does that as well, and is just as creative and imaginative, and we're sort of recreating, if you like, a picture of the world, so that, and not just because it's pretty and lovely, but so that we can fulfill a task. Perhaps I'll just finish with this, which is to look after each other and look after the world better. So maybe this helps. If God gives us the gift of medicine to heal brokenness within people, perhaps God gives us the gift of science to heal the brokenness which is ignorance between us and the world, so that can be healed as well. After all, we are at a point in human history where not only have we learnt that nature can hurt us, we now know how much we can hurt nature, and we must learn fast how not to do that and put that into practice. And science isn't the answer, but it's a tool that we need to take up and use selflessly and mend that brokenness. You know what I'm talking
about. If you look at the chat, Tom, you'll see the effect that your talk has had.
Well, you have to save it for me, because one casualty of my internet dropout is I've lost the whole chat stream.
Right. So, well, when you go on it later on, when you go back, this will be recorded and it'll be on the ISSP website. You'll see the chat. It's incredible. The depth and the maturity and the questions, and they're answering each other's questions as well. It's brilliant. Tom, I can't thank you enough. That has been stimulating and thought-provoking and fascinating, and so many people, all I can see is thanks for a wonderful talk, thanks for the insights, thanks for an interesting lecture. Wow, that was so deep, so interesting. The chat stream is amazing. But what I've never seen on a chat stream of these talks before is a philosophical debate, not just asking you questions, but answering each other. And that speaks volumes.
Love it. Go for it, folks. Keep that debate up. That's what it's been over the centuries. Keep it up.
Please. And you, I believe, very foolishly said you'd come back and you'd talk about science and poetry. And I'm going to take you up on that. Thank you. Okay. So I can't do a round of applause. All I can say is if you go on the YouTube thing later on and you see that chat, you'll see the effect you've had, and you've inspired and made us think and given real hope, and we're getting so much. Thank you so much. It's amazing. What a wonderful, thought-provoking, insightful lecture. I am left incredulous and fascinated. That is one of the things from one of our young people.
Lovely. So Tom, there's all sorts of stuff you can read, as you probably know. So I can give you some reading matter or how to take some of these things further. There's stuff on the web. There's all sorts of resources. So perhaps what I'll do afterwards is give you a few pointers, so whatever website this goes up on, you can put some of those resources on as well.
If you want, yes please, and we will certainly post it on the ISSP website. I'm going to say thank you very much indeed, Tom. You've been amazing, and if you'll please come back in a couple of years' time and do science and poetry, I would be
providing it's live.
Oh God willing, this was never meant to be online. Right. Thank you very much indeed, and good
Real
night.
Pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.